Hi there, my name's Nick and I'm a neurology registrar. In this lecture I'm going to talk about how to put together the findings from your history and examination in order to determine where in the neurological system a lesion lies. So hopefully by now you should be a little bit more comfortable with doing a cranial nerves and upper and lower limbs examination, and now it's all about putting together those findings to try and localize lesions. So to start off with, it's important to have a structured way of answering this question. Neurology is actually very logical, and the location of lesions can actually be explained very logically by just understanding a few basic concepts. So I know there's a lot of fear about having to memorize large amounts of neuroanatomy, and while you do have to know some neuroanatomy, I think just understanding a few basic principles within neuroanatomy can help make the process a lot easier, and we'll go through some of the concepts in this lecture. I know a lot of students fear neurology, and I think a lot of that comes from not understanding these basic concepts, and hopefully this lecture will help to alleviate some of those fears. So, to start off with, in neurology we're always trying to answer two questions. Where is the problem, and what is the problem? If you're able to do those two things, you've done your job as a neurologist. So this lecture is going to focus on where is the problem, which is always the first step. In trying to figure out where a problem is, there are 5 main questions you want to be asking yourself. So the first question you want to ask yourself very simply is which limbs are affected. Are we talking about the arms or the legs, or both arms and both legs, or perhaps just one arm and one leg on the same side? So that goes into whether the symptoms are unilateral or bilateral. The third question is whether the deficits involve problems with movement or sensation or both. The fourth question relates to movement. If there's weakness, you then have to try and figure out whether there is an upper motor neuron lesion or a lower motor neuron lesion within the motor pathway. And the fifth and final point is that if sensation is involved, what modalities and sensation are we talking about? Is there loss of a joint position sense, i.e. proprioception, or is there loss of pain and temperature sensation, i.e. spinothalamic loss? Once you've answered all 5 of these questions, this should give you a much better indicator of where in the neurological system a problem lies. Of course, this is very basic, and there are additional questions that can help you localize lesions to elsewhere, but this is a really good starting point. So as I explained earlier, you do need to know a little bit about neuroanatomy. You don't need to know huge amounts, but if you just understand a few basic neuroanatomy concepts, that will go a long way in making neurology a lot easier and figuring out where a lesion is. So we're going to talk about a few of these concepts. Firstly, we're going to talk about the corticospinal pathway, or the motor pathway, and then we're also going to talk about a couple of the sensory pathways, including the dorsal columns and the spinothalamic tracts. It's also useful to be able to divide up the nervous system into its composite parts in order to describe where a lesion is. So broadly speaking, we can think of the nervous system comprising of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system comprises the brain and the spinal cord, whereas a peripheral nervous system you can think of as being the peripheral nerves, the neuromuscular junction, the muscles and sensory receptors. Furthermore, you can divide up the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, into 3 parts: the cervical, thoracic and lumbar sections. So let's start off with the corticospinal pathway. The corticospinal pathway is the motor pathway. Broadly speaking, it's responsible for voluntary movement of your limbs. It starts up in the cortex, specifically your motor cortex. The pathway then runs down deeper into your brain, into the internal capsule, down through your brainstem and into your medulla. It then crosses to the other side, where it runs down the opposite side of the spinal cord, all the way down to the anterior horn of your spinal cord, after which the impulse then travels out into your peripheral nervous system through the peripheral nerves down into your muscles, activating the muscles and causing movement. And I think the main principle to remember here is that the pathway decussates or crosses over in the medulla, which is part of your brainstem, to the other side of the spinal cord. Hence why the right motor cortex controls the left side of the body, and the left motor cortex up here goes down, crosses into the medulla, and runs down the right side of your spinal cord to activate muscles on the right side of your body. So that's the corticospinal pathway, easy to remember because it runs from your cortex down through your spine, and thereby the impulses travel into your peripheral nerves and muscles. I will be using some repetition in this lecture, but hopefully that will help cement in some of these principles. So that's corticospinal pathway, the motor pathway. Next, let's talk a little bit about the sensory pathways. So as I mentioned before, the two main sensory pathways to be aware of are the dorsal columns, which carry information about proprioception or joint position sense. The second type of sensory tract to be aware of is the spinothalamic tract, which carries information about pain and temperature from your peripheries up into your brain. So let's first consider the dorsal column pathway that carries proprioceptive information. It starts down in your peripheries. It then runs through peripheral nerves before entering the spinal cord. The impulse then travels on the same side of the spinal cord that it entered into, all the way up to your medulla, where it then decussates, i.e. crosses over to the other side before ascending up into your brain on the opposite side to which the impulse had originally entered, where it synapses with another neuron which goes to your sensory cortex. So here you have an impulse traveling in from the left side of the body, going up the spinal cord, crossing over, going up into your brain and going to the sensory cortex in the right side of your brain, up here. And similarly, information about proprioception or joint position sense from the right side of your body will come in through the peripheral nerves on the right side of your body, from your arms or your legs. It'll then ascend on the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord, i.e. the right side of the spinal cord, all the way up to your medulla, where it then decussates over onto the left, where it then ascends into your brain and into your sensory cortex in the left side of your body. So the right sensory cortex detects sensory information from the left side of your body, and the left sensory cortex detects sensory information from the right side of your body. The main thing to remember with the dorsal column pathways is that the decussation is in the medulla, similarly to how it was in the corticospinal pathway. Let's now move on to the spinothalamic tract. Now the spinothalamic tract is also a sensory pathway, but it carries information about pain and temperature rather than proprioception. So let's follow the pathway. So pain and temperature information is carried by the peripheral nerves in your limbs or from your body into the spinal cord via peripheral nerves. And the thing to remember about the spinothalamic tract is it then crosses over or decussates pretty much immediately or within a couple of levels over to the other side of the spinal cord. So whereas in the dorsal column pathway, it didn't decussate until it got up to the medulla, here in the spinothalamic tract, it decussates pretty much straight away to the other side of the spinal cord. After that, the impulse then travels up the contralateral side of the spinal cord to which it entered until it gets to the thalamus, and the thalamus it then synapses with another neuron that carries that information about pain and temperature up to the sensory cortex. The right sensory cortex is still detecting sensory information from the left side of the body, but unlike the dorsal column pathway where it crossed over in the medulla, in the spinothalamic tract it crossed over straight away before ascending. That's the main distinction between the spinothalamic tract and the dorsal column pathway. So hopefully, armed with that neuroanatomical knowledge, we can do a few cases to help cement in these principles. So case number one, let's consider a man who comes in with weakness in his left arm and left leg. We're not given any information about his sensation in this question, so let's ignore these sensory pathways. I'm just going to move that out of the way, and let's just concentrate on the corticospinal tract. So if a man had left arm and leg weakness, where in his neurological system could a lesion lie? Now, I'll give you a couple of minutes, or maybe just half a minute, to consider that, and then we'll talk about it. So if a patient presented with left arm and left leg weakness, then we have to think about a lesion in the corticospinal pathway, i.e. the motor pathway. Where in that corticospinal pathway the lesion lies, we can't be sure at this stage, but all we know is it can lie anywhere along that corticospinal pathway, all the way from the motor cortex, the internal capsule in the brain, down into the brainstem, the left side of the spinal cord, down into the anterior horn on the left side of the spinal cord, or even the peripheral nerves on the left side of the body. Now we need to try and figure out where in the corticospinal pathway that lesion lies. And if we go back to the questions, we had the start, we need to work out which limbs. Well, we've already been told it's the left arm and left leg. And that syndrome is called a hemiparesis. And when someone's got a hemiparesis, we always think about problems in the brain, because the motor cortex on one side of the brain controls the arm and the leg on the opposite side of the body. A more rare cause can be a lesion high up in the cervical cord on the left side of the spinal cord. So we've talked a little bit about which limbs are affected. Unilateral, bilateral, we know it's unilateral, hence it's a hemiparesis. We don't know about whether sensation's involved. We do know it's a motor problem, so we know there's a problem in the corticospinal pathway. Next question, we know that movement is involved, so now we've got to work out whether it's an upper motor neuron lesion or a lower motor neuron lesion. Why do we have to do that? Because if it's an upper motor neuron lesion, then we know the problem is in the brain or within the spinal cord. Whereas if it is a lower motor neuron lesion, then we know that the problem is outside the central nervous system, i.e. in the peripheral nervous system, in the peripheral nerves or the plexus. And if you remember back to your neurological examinations, the way to work out whether a problem is upper or lower motor neuron is to look at things like tone and reflexes. So hypertonia, hyperreflexia is a sign of an upper motor neuron lesion, whereas hypotonia and hyporeflexia are signs of a lower motor neuron lesion. So hang on, let's go back to our case. So work out whether it's an upper or lower motor neuron problem, because that'll tell you whether it's a central or peripheral nervous system problem, respectively. So let's just mention one more thing. To be honest, I think I've answered this question already, but if I was to ask you which part of the spinal cord could be affected if the patient had left arm and leg weakness, where in the spinal cord do you think could be affected? Well, it's really only the cervical section of the spinal cord that can be affected, because if the lesion was below T1 there in the spinal cord, then that wouldn't affect the arms, because remember, the nerves that supply the muscles in the arms run between C5 and T1. So a lesion below T1 would not affect the arm muscles, it would affect the legs. So you know that if the arms are affected, the lesion must be above T1. So we can say this is a cervical cord lesion. So case 2. We are told that the patient has weakness in the right leg. So again, I'm just going to move this out of the way. So we're going to forget sensation for now, because we're not given any information about sensation. All we're told is that a patient has weakness in the right leg. So same process again. We know that the muscles in the right leg are innervated and activated by the corticospinal motor tract that begins in the left side of the brain, the left motor cortex. That corticospinal tract then runs down through the internal capsule, down to the medulla, where it crosses to the other side, so the right side of the spinal cord, where it runs down the spinal cord, the right side of the spinal cord, to the anterior horn, before innervating peripheral nerves that run down out into the peripheral nerves to innervate the muscles in the right leg. So when we have weakness in the right leg, where do you think a problem could lie? I'll give you a minute or so to consider that. So if there's weakness in the right leg, then we know that there must be a problem in the corticospinal tract going from the left motor cortex down the right side of the spinal cord into the peripheral nerves and into the muscles. So at the moment, all we know is that there is a problem in that corticospinal tract. To work out where within that corticospinal tract the problem lies, we need to figure out again whether it's an upper or lower motor neuron lesion, upper being central and lower motor neuron being peripheral nervous system lesion, to figure out whether it's a problem in the brain and spinal cord or a problem in the peripheral nerves or muscles. So with right leg weakness, if you had upper motor neuron signs, you might think there's a problem in the left motor cortex or the right side of the spinal cord. If there are lower motor neuron signs, then you might think that there is a problem in the peripheral nerves going down into the right leg. Okay, so first question to ask, upper or lower motor neuron lesion. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you find hypertonia and hyperreflexia, i.e. signs of an upper motor neuron problem, suggesting a central nervous system problem. then you know that the problem must be in the brain or the spinal cord. We already said that the corticospinal tract that innervates the right leg runs from the left motor cortex down to the medulla, crosses over to the right side of the cord, runs down the right side of the cord. So we know that the problem must be along that corticospinal tract. Can we narrow it down even more? The problem was in the brain and there was right leg weakness. You might expect the arm on the opposite side to be involved, as we had in the last case, causing a hemiparesis. So the fact that this is a monoparesis, i.e. just one limb involved, might suggest a problem further down in the spine. That's not strictly true, because there are lesions in the brain that can cause just a single limb weakness, anterior cerebral artery infarct, or a smaller lesion at the top of the motor homunculus in the left motor cortex, causing an isolated right leg weakness. But if we're thinking that the problem is in the cord, then we can say that the problem must be below T1, because remember, if the problem was in the cord and it was above T1, then that would likely affect the nerves that are supplying the muscles in the arm. So you'd expect a hemiparesis, so right arm and leg weakness, if you had a cord lesion above T1. Is there a way of knowing in right leg weakness whether it's in the brain or a spinal cord lesion below T1? Yes. To do this, we'll need to incorporate our knowledge of the sensory tracts. So if I bring these back in, you can see that if we are talking about right leg weakness and we are suspecting that the problem is in the left motor cortex on the left side of the brain, then you would expect sensory loss in joint position sense or proprioception on the right side of the body. So remember, information about proprioception is carried in from the right leg through the peripheral nerves until it reaches the spinal cord. It then ascends up the same ipsilateral side of the spinal cord until it gets to the medulla, where it then decussates to the other side, the left side, before ascending up into the brain and into the sensory cortex in the left side of the brain. So if you have a problem on the left side of the brain interrupting the motor and sensory cortices, then you'll have right leg weakness and proprioceptive loss in the right leg. You would also have loss of pain and temperature sensation in the right leg, because remember, the information about pain and temperature sensation from the right leg is carried through the peripheral nerves in the right leg until it reaches the spinal cord and then decussates to the other side and goes up the opposite side of the spinal cord, the left side of the spinal cord, all the way up until it gets to the left side of the brain, particularly the sensory cortex in the left side of the brain. So if you have a problem in the left side of the brain, you'll get right leg pain and temperature loss, right leg proprioceptive loss, and right leg weakness. Whereas if the lesion was in the spinal cord on the right hand side, say around here, then you'd have interruption of the corticospinal tract going to the right leg, causing the right leg weakness. You'd also have interruption of the dorsal columns carrying proprioceptive sensation from the right leg, ascending up the right side of the cord and into the brain. So you'd get loss of joint position sense in the right leg, because it would interrupt the tracts in the right side of the cord, which includes the dorsal column pathways carrying proprioceptive sensation from the right leg. However, a lesion on the right side of the cord would interrupt the pain and temperature pathway, i.e. the spinothalamic pathway, carrying information from the left side of the body. Because remember, pain and temperature information from the left leg or left side of the body enters the spinal cord via peripheral nerves before it decussates immediately to the other side and ascends up the right side of the spinal cord. So you'd have weakness in the right leg, you'd have dorsal column pathway interrupted in the right leg, causing right leg proprioceptive loss, but you'd have left leg or left-sided pain and temperature sensation loss. And that can help you work out whether the problem is in the brain or in the spinal cord. Right, the next case, we're told that a patient has weakness of both legs. So how can you get weakness of both legs? Again, I'm going to move this out of the way because we're just talking about weakness. We're not given any information about sensation. So if a patient has weakness in both legs, just spend a few seconds to think what that means in terms of where a lesion can lie. Okay, so if a patient has weakness of both legs, that would suggest that there is an interruption in both corticospinal tracts on both sides. That would mean either there's a problem in both motor cortices on opposite sides of the brain, or it could mean that there is a problem in the spinal cord. Now, you can get weakness of both legs caused by infarcts of the anterior cerebral arteries, causing infarcts of the motor cortex responsible for leg movement on both sides of the brain. That's relatively uncommon, and usually when a patient has weakness of both legs, that's much more commonly caused by spinal cord lesions, because remember, the corticospinal tracts run a lot closer to each other in the spinal cord than they do in the brain. If you think of the brain, the corticospinal tracts are on opposite sides of the cortex, and you need to affect both sides, as you can in an anterior cerebral artery infarct, where you have infarction of both motor cortices, but it's much more common to have a spinal cord injury that could be traumatic or inflammatory or whatever cause, because a single lesion in the spinal cord can interrupt both corticospinal pathways because they run quite close to each other in the spine. And of course, this syndrome is called a paraparesis, where you have weakness of both legs. Again, we've got weakness, so we need to try and figure out where in the corticospinal tract the weakness is. Of course, the lesion could be in the peripheral nervous system, so it could be in the peripheral nerves that are running down both legs, and that could be due to problems such as Guillain-Barré or problems in the musculature in the leg. So remember, although we've spoken about central nervous system problems causing problems in the brain and the spinal cord, it could still be a peripheral nerve lesion. Okay, so that's weakness of both legs. Right, let's move on to case 4. So now we're talking about sensory problems. So in this case, a patient has loss of proprioception in the left leg. Which sensory tract are we talking about when there's a loss of proprioception? We're talking about the dorsal column pathway. So if a patient has loss of joint position sense in the left leg, if we think of this picture radiologically, there's information about proprioception coming in from the left side of the body, such as the left leg. It's entering the spinal cord, where it runs up the same side of the spinal cord until it gets to the medulla, where it decussates across to the other side, runs up to the thalamus before the impulse is carried by a final neuron up to the sensory cortex. So if you've got loss of proprioception from the left side of the body, we know that the problem must lie in either the peripheral nerves carrying that sensation about proprioception into the spine, or it must be a problem on the left side of the spine as it ascends to the thalamus, or a problem in the right side of the brain. So the problem could lie anywhere along this pathway, either centrally, i.e. brain and spinal cord, or peripherally. So how are you going to figure that out? How are you going to figure out whether it's in the brain, the spinal cord, or in the peripheral nerves? So this is where we need some additional information about the movement. Is there weakness? If there is weakness, that would help us out, because let's say that the left leg was weak and there was a lower motor neuron signs on examination. So you would know that if the left leg is weak, there's a peripheral nervous system problem in the leg, and there's loss of proprioception in the left leg, that would suggest a problem in the peripheral nerves. If there were upper motor neuron signs with left leg weakness, then you know that the problem must be in the brain or the spinal cord. So when you're trying to figure out sensory problems, it's a good idea to combine them with your examination of the patient's movement to try and tie those two together. Okay, so the next case is a patient who has loss of pain and temperature sensation in the right leg. So we're thinking about the spinothalamic tract. Pain and temperature sensation in the right leg is carried into the spinal cord by peripheral nerves, where it crosses to the other side of the cord before ascending up the opposite side of the cord into the opposite side of the brain and opposite sensory cortex. So here we're talking about right leg, but this picture is showing the spinothalamic tract coming from the left side, but you can see the left side coming in, crossing over to the other side of the cord, ascending up the opposite side of the cord, and going to the right sensory cortex. So we know that if someone's got loss of pain and temperature sensation in the right leg, the lesion can be anywhere from the peripheral nerves coming into the spine, or a problem in the left side of the spinal cord as it's ascending up the opposite side of the spinal cord to that which it entered, until it gets to the thalamus, at the thalamus, then synapses with another neuron where it goes into the left sensory cortex. So the problem could be in the left sensory cortex, the left internal capsule, the left side of the cord, or the peripheral nerves in the right leg. Again, as we said for the last case, to figure out whether it's a problem in the brain or the spinal cord or in the peripheral nerves, combine it with your motor examination to figure out whether there is an upper motor neuron syndrome or a low motor neuron syndrome that suggests a central or peripheral nervous system cause. However, with that said, there is a way of telling whether a problem is in the brain or the spinal cord by comparing it to whether there is any loss of proprioception. For example, let's say that a patient had a problem in their right sensory cortex. That would affect the dorsal column pathway supplying the left side of the body, and it would also affect the spinothalamic sensation supplying the left side of the body. So if there was loss of proprioception and pain and temperature sensation on the left side of the body, that would suggest that the problem is after both tracts have decussated to the other side, i.e. within the brain or the right somatosensory cortex. Whereas if there was a lesion in the left side of the cord, that would cause loss of joint position sense from the left side of the body, because remember, it catches this tract, this dorsal column pathway running from the left side of the body up the left side of the cord, but it would catch the spinothalamic sensation running from the right side of the body. So the pain and temperature sensation from the right side of the body enters the cord, crosses over and runs up the left side of the cord. So a lesion on the left side of the cord would catch pain and temperature sensation coming in from the right side of the body. A left-sided cord would catch the joint position sense coming in from the left side of the body. And that's called a dissociative sensory loss, alternatively known as Brown-Séquard syndrome. One point to note is that if there is a problem in the peripheral nervous system suggested by a lower motor neuron picture on your examination, then you'd get loss of a joint position sense and pain and temperature sensation from the same side of the body. Okay, so I've kind of already explained this now. So the next case, so loss of proprioception in the left leg and loss of pain sensation in the left leg. So if we've got loss of proprioception and pain sensation in the left leg, that would suggest that there is a problem in either the peripheral nerves, which carry proprioceptive and pain sensation from the same side of the body, or it could suggest a lesion in the right side of the brain. Again, you could combine this with information about movement from the corticospinal tract. So let's say the lesion was up here in the brain. If the lesion involved the motor cortex from the right side of the brain, then you might also expect weakness on the left side of the body, such as the left leg. Whereas if there were lower motor neuron signs on your examination and the patient had a weak left leg, that would support the lesion being in your peripheral nerves that run down your left leg. Okay, so the next case, we have loss of proprioception in both legs, but normal pain sensation in both legs. So how do we explain this? How can you have loss of proprioception in both legs, and how can you have normal pain sensation in both legs? I'll give you a few seconds to consider that. Well, here we have to consider the spinal tracts. So here is a cross-section of your spinal cord, and these are the dorsal columns, so named because they're in the dorsum of the spinal cord, right at the back. And here are your spinothalamic tracts, which are quite ventral in the spinal cord. So if you have loss of proprioception in both legs, remember proprioception is carried by the dorsal columns, these blue dorsal columns, then you've taken out your dorsal columns on both sides of your spinal cord. And there are a number of conditions that can do that. First of all, you could have traumatic injury to your spinal cord at the back, which takes out all of these dorsal columns. Or sometimes, quite commonly, you can get B12 deficiency that specifically affects the dorsal columns. So you have loss of proprioception, B12 deficiency or damage to the back of your cord might not affect these more anterior, more ventral spinothalamic tracts, and that's how you can get loss of proprioception, but with intact pain and temperature sensation, with intact spinothalamic tracts here. Conversely, if you have loss of pain sensation, let's say in both legs, but normal proprioception in both legs, that would suggest that would suggest that you have taken out your spinothalamic tracts here, but your dorsal columns at the back are intact, and things that can cause that are conditions such as an anterior spinal cord infarct that supplies blood to the anterior part of your spinal cord. Therefore, an infarct in that could take out both your spinothalamic tracts, causing loss of pain and temperature sensation in both legs, but it might leave your dorsal columns intact, hence it might leave normal proprioception. One thing to note is we're talking about the legs, not the arms. So again, remember, if we're saying that the nerves that supply the muscles in your arms come from C5 to T1, whereas lesions below T1 affect your legs. So the lesion is likely to be lower down in your spinal cord than higher up, because if it was higher up between C5 to T1, then you might expect your arms to be involved as well, because sensory information is carried by those higher up cervical nerves. So if you had a cervical lesion, you might get lots of sensation in your arms, not just in your legs. If you're wondering what these yellow tracts are, these are the corticospinal tracts. Okay, so hopefully that's really all you need to remember. So, the nice thing about neurology is I don't think you need to learn huge lists of information. You just need to understand a few basic concepts, and then a lot of things make sense. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. You are welcome to put some questions down in the comments and I'll try and answer them if I haven't explained anything properly. Okay, thank you very much.